Welcome to Netalog on CGTN. I'm Zhou in Beijing. For many of us, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed our relationship with food. Now the United Nations is warning that the world stands on the brink of a food crisis worse than any in the last 50 years. How worried should we be? And what will the post-pandemic food supply system look like? And how have our eating habits changed? To discuss these issues and more, I'm honored to be joined on today's live webcast by Dan Buettner, the National Geographic Fellow, Kathy Freston, New York Times bestselling author, and Fan Shenggen, Chair Professor at China Agricultural University, Professor Kelly D. Brownell, Director of the World Food Policy Center at Duke University, and Victor Koo, co-founder of Tianren Culture and founder of Youku. And viewers at home can also join by leaving your questions or messages in the comment section of our social media account. I'd also like to thank the Good Food Fund of the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation for their support of our program. Why don't we start by making the opening statement within 1 minute on the eating habits today and what actually influence the way we eat. Let me start with Dan. Dan?
Yes, so my work has largely been around the populations who live the longest around the world. And what's happened now in most of the world is the most accessible foods, while they may be inexpensive, they're unhealthy. And my position is that's driving the chronic disease load, mortality rate of COVID, and it's cutting our lives short by as much as a decade in most industrialized countries around the world.
Okay, Kathy?
Hi. Well, food is dictated by tradition. We eat what the culture has shown us for years. We eat what our parents made for us. And a lot of that is meat, dairy, and eggs. We grow up thinking that that means and abundance. And unfortunately, the global demand for meat is rising, and the current meat production system is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to things like the pandemic, COVID, what we've just been through, to locust swarms, to environmental climate change. It's a very fragile system, and so that has to change. We can tweak traditions so we still enjoy the same foods, but we have to make it more sustainable and more resilient.
Do you think better nutrition and better food have been contributed to longer life expectancy here in China? Or they're also suffering the results of relying on food that is too salty, sweet, and oily?
Yeah, I think overall, the diet quality in China has improved, and we must acknowledge that. On the other hand, as the time continues to move on, we must pay attention to what we eat. That will cut down our life expectancy.
And Kelly, you seem to agree that actually the food industry contributing to some of the health problems we see in the advanced economies.
Well, this is showing up in rates of childhood obesity, for example. There's a group in London, the World Obesity Federation, that released a report last year on projected rates of childhood obesity going into the future. And so, for example, we think of a lot of childhood obesity in the United States, but in 2030, for children ages 5 to 9, the rates in the United States are expected to be 26% of children being overweight or obese. And in China, the numbers are expected to be 32%.
More than the United States?
More than the United States. And this federation also established the likelihood of meeting the goals that have been set for 2025 by the World Health Organization, which is a very modest goal, which is to have no increase in prevalence in childhood obesity. And they predict that the United States only has 17% chance of meeting that goal. They predict China has 0% chance of meeting that goal.
Why is that? Why is China has a 0% of meeting that goal?
Probably the combination of declining physical activity and deterioration in the diet. You get improvements in lifespan as undernutrition gets corrected, but unfortunately there are corporate interests that overcorrect the problem and people are consuming too many calories, too much salt, fat, and sugar, and as a consequence, you get these very high rates of obesity.
But Victor, you are entrepreneurs. Do you think the food industry have the incentive to make that paradigm shift, making more plant-based food, relying less on meat and those ingredients that may be harmful to human health?
Well, first of all, I think the public awareness needs to be improved and changed. And I think we have opportunity with what's happening with COVID-19, where I think especially the younger audience that Kathy pointed out are really more conscious about the importance of health, how to improve their immunity, and the correlation between pre-existing conditions as well as fatality rates. And so the awareness on the consumer side is very important. And at the end of the day, the businesses will look at demand patterns to really decide what they want to provide. But at the same time, it's very important to provide delicious options. The problem is the misperception sometimes that vegetarian options, especially here in China, think they may not taste very good or are for religious reasons. So I think there needs to be a complete public awareness campaign to change that thinking for people to realize a vegetarian or a plant-forward diet is one good for you, good for the environment, and good for the world.
Kelly, meat alternatives, it seems to be a new idea. It's catching up fast. According to a study by Barclays Banks, the global market could be worth $140 billion in the next 10 years. Do you think it will be the future for meat, alternative meat?
I think it's likely to be at least part of the picture, but I think it's too early to know the health consequences of consuming these products. And also, I think it's a little too early to know the true environmental consequences of producing them. So I'd say that the jury is still out on those. Now, an interesting...
It is assumed it is less stressful on the environment than the traditional meat industry.
Yes, but it may depend in part on the way the traditional meat is produced. So there's a relatively, new in terms of public attention approach to agriculture known as regenerative agriculture, where you rotationally graze animals with no carbon inputs. The grasses that can grow from these conditions sequester carbon. Now, it's too early to know whether that is true, but there's some evidence that suggests it might be. So it's possible that the environmental impact of raising animals can be minimized, and that might change the equation between the artificially produced meat and the meat produced from animals.
But why some food companies already ambitiously and aggressively trying out that option already?
Well, if it turns out to be that these products are better for health, human health, and they're better for the environment, then hooray, I think we all have something to feel good about. But it's possible that if the environmental impact of raising farm animals can be reduced, then there may not be such an environmental difference as we might expect.
Can I just interject here something? The regenerative agriculture, I agree, is something really important to look at. The problem is the global demand for meat is so huge that's why we have factory farms. That's why we have concentrated animal feeding operations, is because the demand is so high. So if we were to move to a system like that, we couldn't possibly, if we took down every building in the entire world and returned everything to nature, to grazing, we still would not have enough land to graze animals in that way. That's the thing. We have to reduce the meat that we eat, the amount of meat that we eat. So that's the ideal thing. And plus the burgers and the sausage, those are fun foods. It's more of the blue zones eating whole grains and beans and vegetables and things like that. And every once in a while we have a fun burger or a sausage or something like that. But the idea is that we really need to reduce our meat consumption, because even in the best practices where we're using the soil, we're regenerating, we're rotating, and we're raising animals humanely, even in the best conditions, we cannot supply a fraction of the global meat demand.
So what
We have
what will be the regulators do to turn things into a direction that is both cost effective and also healthy for people and environment?
Well, can I say here, they have been working on policy issues. One is we do not invest enough in innovations to cut down the carbon emission of food production. The secondly, yes, consumer behaviors. Consumer wanted to consume something is tasty, but don't forget, we can actually develop children's taste while they are still very young. The school feeding programs from primary school, middle school, high school, even to universities. You can actually influence people's preference. Then taxing. If, let's say, the beef production has emitted 20 times more carbons than, let's say, crop-based proteins use 20 times more water, this sort of environmental cost has not been reflected in pricing. And then similarly on health. If you eat too much meat, then you will have diabetes or heart attack or even certain cancers. It's not just the cost to you, to your family. It is a cost to the society. How can we reflect that cost in pricing that food is very critical. So if we can tax unsustainable, unhealthy foods, particularly meat, and use that money for innovations to cut down emissions, to protect our land, to protect our biodiversity, is the way to go.
I agree with the professor, but I want to add one thing here. Is the public awareness of those issues are still very weak, especially here in China. What people don't realize is if you look at the top leading causes of death in China, now actually in the last decade, it's become exactly the same as the US. If you look at cardiovascular diseases, cancer, as well as chronic respiratory disease, that's driving 77% of the deaths in China. And I would bet that the public awareness of that is very, very low. And out of those factors, actually, if you look at the key determinants of these major diseases, chronic diseases, diet and nutrition is actually 53%, and smoking being the second is 16%. Those two factors in terms of diet and nutrition, as well as smoking, drives all the leading causes of death in both China as well as the US. But the public awareness of this and the drivers behind this is actually not being promoted enough. Whereas, and on the other hand, all the existing companies are promoting fast foods, industrial farmed products. And so you don't have a counterbalance within the society of people understanding the costs and benefits of this, which drives policy and which drives businesses.
Do we expect some blowbacks from food in the industry? Because we saw that in cigarette industry decades ago. They wouldn't be very comfortable having that kind of change.
Yeah, the food industry has behaved very much like the tobacco industry behaved decades ago, using the same playbook, using the same public relations firms, and basically using the same arguments, that it's not our product that's causing harm, it's overuse of the product. And therefore, the responsibility should be shifted from the corporations to the individuals. But more and more people aren't accepting that argument. And that's why things like getting rid of sugared beverages in schools, getting rid of junk foods in schools, taxing these things is becoming more common. So the industry is pushing back with tremendous amounts of money and public relations, but they're not winning the battles for the most part.
And at the same time, they are investing in plant-based products. And so they see an opportunity for huge growth. And you see some of the biggest meat and processed food companies like Tyson and Cargill getting into the alt protein business because they see that as the future. They're losing money with COVID when slaughterhouse workers are dying in untold numbers and they're putting animals, they're killing them because they can't use them. It's just an unsustainable food system. So they're seeing the future, and these big food companies are getting in on it. They see opportunity. And so that's when things start to change, is when these big corporations embrace the future and they move toward it, and they're making things that are more price accessible, and it's going to be out there in a bigger way.
Are you guys optimistic anytime soon in the world? more plant-based food, more sustainable and reliable food source?
I'm hugely optimistic. I think it's happening so much faster than we could have expected. You've got this intersection of food companies starting to invest and awareness of the younger generation of what's happening in our environment and human health. And those two things have intersected and it's exploding. So I'm very optimistic.
Well, in fact, I think go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, I think me too. To do more. One is obviously policy. I have already mentioned policy is very critical. Until you change the policy, you're not going to move very far. That's number one. Number two, innovations. I do think there are enough innovations that have not been taken into consideration. Innovations, let's say, in conserving water, conserving land, conserving biodiversity, and the carbon reduction. And lots of technologies over there. We have not done a good job in using this technology or scale them up. Then thirdly, behavior change. Can we use the modern technologies to change the behavior? I know the anti-smoking movement, wearing seatbelt movement is a social movement. I think we should do the same thing.
I agree with the professor. I think the other point is this time window is very, very critical because COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease, which means it was actually transmitted from animal food to humans. And because of the correlation between food and really the fatality rate, is a really important opportunity to raise public awareness in China as well as in globally between the ties of food as well as health as well as environment. But we also need to leverage the opportunity now.
What about you, Dan?
Well, I think people are generally aware when they're eating junk food. I think people like to eat the food they like to eat, and that's most convenient. One.
How do you change people's choices?
I'll give you a real world example. So we were hired by the whole island of Hawaii to try to change their eating habits. And instead of trying to convince them to take on new innovation, we looked at the pre-1940s diet of Hawaii that we found was mostly tubers, complex carbohydrates, and we marketed them the idea of eating their traditional foods. And if you look at the traditional diet of China, you're going to find complex carbohydrates, you're going to find lots of greens, you're going to find beans, you're going to find that meat is a celebratory food that wasn't eaten very much except for maybe the Lunar New Year. And I think there's a really rich opportunity to these chefs that spend so much time making pork belly taste delicious or bone marrow, if they take the traditional foods of China and make them taste delicious, it's not a big sell. And by the way, the reason people ate a certain way for thousands of years is because it worked for their local environment, it was sustainable, and they probably were calorically deficient, but for the most part, they were getting the nutrition they need. So instead of just looking forward for some new technology to create some new meat analog, I would argue looking back at traditional Chinese cuisine, stuff that peasants were eating, and having chefs make that taste good again, and having local policies favoring that kind of food over the highly processed foods.
Is that applicable, Professor Fan? That we go back to our traditional way of cuisine, but also make it marketable and accessible?
Sure. Well, I grew up in a very poor village in southern China, so I was hungry, I was malnourished. I experienced all kinds of forms of malnutrition, undernutrition. I don't think we should go back to our traditional poor peasant diet.
No.
So
I just mean the food.
Right.
Not the lack of it.
Well, let me come back to the opportunity we are really facing, the COVID-19. So here in China, I came back to China about 6 months ago, being in US for 35 years. And COVID-19 really gave us, well, COVID-19 obviously is a crisis, is a challenge. It gives us a unique opportunity to change people's diet. We have done a survey, consumer survey, that consumers are willing to change their diet. They wanted to reduce the consumption or even ban the consumption of wildlife. There's absolutely no question about it. The second, they wanted to have a more healthy and nutritious diets because they know that if they have non-communicable diseases, they will be very vulnerable to COVID-19 diseases. So that message is clear. How can we use this momentum, this as an opportunity to make sure that our diets will continue to be healthy and sustainable, even COVID-19 is gone?
Okay, I'd like to talk about food safety a little bit because obviously we all want better food, healthier food. But what about those people who are facing the threat of no food? Since the end of 2019, locust swarms, COVID-19, floods, especially in East Africa, have affected the local food supplies and caused price fluctuations. Some countries are restricting exports because of their worry about chaos and probably disruption of supply. So what impact will these factors have on global food supply? And what should we do about it?
Yeah, well, it is a wake-up call for everybody. For Africa, for South Asian countries, they will think how they can secure their food supply during crisis. Whether it's a trade war, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's climate change, I think it is a wake-up call. It's not necessarily bad. I think they must rethink of a global food system we must have to make sure that, yes, trade remains open because trade will make sure that we can consume, fruits or foods from every part of the world, not just in my neighboring, let's say, farms. So that's a good part of the trade. But on the other hand, we must make sure that if some sort of shocks come, we have a way to deal with it. Trade should remain open, supply chains should continue to work, and poor people must have social protection, whether it's income, whether it's a cash transfer, whether it's a food assistance programs, particularly school feeding programs. They must continue to work, to run.
I've got some questions from the internet. Some users are watching our discussions. This is from Weibo. Alice in Wonderland said, will the post-COVID era be more about how to eat healthy than how to eat delicious? Will that affect people's happy index around the world? I'm simply not happy eating healthy food. What do you say to that?
I say they're eating the wrong healthy food. I mean, it's so easy.
But there isn't many options. They're saying, I can choose delicious food wherever I want, but I can't choose delicious healthy food because I don't know.
It's a little jump. I don't know if you've ever gone from, say, drinking whole milk to skim milk or lower fat milk. At first, when you taste it, it's like, I don't really like it. It's not as rich. But when you decide, okay, you know what? I know this is better for the planet. I'm just going to push myself a little bit. I'm going to lean into it. It's not perfect right away. It's not exactly the same right away. But there's so much upside to tweaking your taste buds, and it takes like 10 days.
It takes effort then. People hate taking effort.
Yeah. I just wanted to use my family's example. So we used to eat, the white rice, the white bread, and so on. But because of our knowledge about nutrition and health, about 15 years ago, we began to reduce the meat consumption. We begin to consume brown rice, the whole wheat bread, and so on. Actually, today, we really like the food we eat. If you ask me to come back to eat white rice, it does not taste anything. If you ask me to eat white bread, I don't want to have it. So it takes maybe a month or two.
Professor, you're asking everybody to spend some years to cultivate that habit, which is not easy to get.
With a university, that's a university. This China Agricultural University has the best student cafeteria among all the universities here in Beijing. You know why? Because they work with some of the nutritionists to cook nutritious, healthy, and tasty foods. So they ranked #1. So next time when you have a chance to come to China Agricultural University, try the student cafeteria.
So,
You know, it's
so you
also-
have to send out the message. It's not only smart, it's also intelligent to try something other than the traditional food. Kelly, what do you want to say?
Well, I think government can also help this process along in important ways. You know, it's not an easy thing to do on a broad scale because the unhealthy food has a powerful biological reinforcing effect on people. I mean, sugar in particular.
We are genetically wired to like those kind of food.
Yeah, we are, and sugar in particular triggers addictive properties in the brain. You get withdrawal, you probably get tolerance, you get cravings and things. So it's not easy to do the retraining, although it can be done. So some people can just do it on their own, and we've heard some good examples of that. But the question is, can government help this process along? And I think government can. For example, by changing the relative price of healthy and unhealthy foods. That will encourage people to consume more of the healthy foods. They can get accustomed to them, and their preferences can change. Changing the foods available in schools can make a big difference in the same way. So I think if government gets involved in a way that helps push some of these things along, we can accelerate the process.
Yeah. All right, and thank you very much, my panelists. Very insightful and useful information for food, and I hope our audiences can also learn something today. Thank you for your wonderful talks and analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.